Ever since fandom culture first began to take off in popularity within the unregulated hellscape known as the internet, people have been testing the limits of acceptable content. Now, well into the era of ethical consumption, call-out culture, and post-purge Tumblr, the debate over what does or does not belong in fandom spaces is impossible to avoid, and often toxic to engage in. So here we are, engaging with it.
This video is meant to explore the ethical questions posed by real-person fanfiction, as well as fanfiction of both real and fictional minors. We do not imply that our opinion is law. We aren't even positive where we stand on some of these issues ourselves. This video shares some of our thoughts on these subjects, as well as some of the tentative conclusions we reached.
This video is not about the laws surrounding fanworks, as it's an extremely complicated issue and we are nowhere near experts. Laws vary significantly by location/country, and neither of us feel qualified to comment on the legality of fanwork. This video focuses on ethical obligations and expectations.
Now, before we get into the meat of the discussion, some notes and disclaimers. Real-person fanfiction can be defined as any fanfiction story that includes at least one real-life person, usually excluding historical figures, although there is no set definition of who counts as a historical figure.
Smut refers to NSFW fanworks involving explicit sexual situations between fictional characters, usually intended to be enjoyed by viewers. The category of smut does not encompass all romance fanworks.
We use the term minor in this video to refer to anyone under the age of consent, which is accepted to be 18 in most online spaces.
Lastly, just to reiterate, this is not a call-out video. We do not support the shaming or harassing of anyone creating or consuming fanworks of any kind. Nor do we support shaming or harassing anyone for their opinions. You can disagree with and criticize others without doing this.
This entire debate has led to a great deal of toxic behavior between fans and antis and outsiders and creators. The last thing we want is to contribute to the toxicity of fandom culture. We ask you to please respect our opinions, but we invite you to respectfully express yours in the comments.
So, have any new video ideas recently?
It's been impossible to watch anything in my house unless I literally barricade myself inside of my room. Like, my brother has been watching all the Formula One races this season, and they're literally all that I can hear.
Interesting. So I assume you haven't been writing as much lately either.
I have a new Avatar The Last Airbender fanfic coming out on AO3 soon.
Speaking of AO3, you know what's really interesting? The other day, I started wondering if there's any fanfiction of these Formula One drivers, and so purely out of curiosity, I looked it up on AO3. And it's actually a whole community. It's pretty popular, too. Like, it's got over 11,000 fanfics. And most of them involve the drivers being shipped with each other.
Okay, again, interesting. How old are they?
Anywhere from their early 20s to early 40s. Why?
I was just wondering if they're familiar enough with the internet to know that they're all being shipped together.
That's an interesting question. I know some of the younger ones do stream on Twitch, so maybe they do just through being moderately famous on the internet. But I don't think the older ones would know, even if they had a social media presence. I think it would be weird, though, personally, if I suddenly found out that there was a whole community of people dedicated to shipping me with my friends and teammates.
Yeah, it's strange. It is typical internet stuff, though. You know, the internet just can't let people be friends.
Yeah, but something about it just rubs me the wrong way. Like, have you been hearing much about pro shippers and antis on Twitter?
Only the bits I absorb through cultural osmosis.
Well, the debate is incredibly heated and complex, but it centers around the ethics of fanworks. As in, what is ethical or moral to make content about? Who is it acceptable to ship? And if we decide something isn't moral, are people still free to engage with it?
Those are certainly issues I could see people getting really passionate about.
Honestly, when I think about writing fanfiction about real people, I feel like the ethical issue is particularly relevant. Fanfiction writers rarely have the permission of any public figure to put them in their stories. Is that not a violation of their consent?
Do you think that means fans shouldn't write RPF at all?
It's hard. On one hand, I do think the best way to protect public figures is to just discourage this kind of behavior. On the other hand, the point of fanfiction is to be revolutionary and cross the boundaries established by publishing houses. Who is anybody to tell somebody who they can and cannot write?
That's my thought. When Anne Rice says she doesn't want us writing gay erotica of her books, my instinct is to write more just to spite her. Not that I write that stuff, just people in general, I mean. So why is RPF any different?
Because it's people's personal lives. Not only that, but their relationships. Do you remember when Fan was such a huge shipping community back in like 2015?
Not really.
Dan Howell and Phil Lester were a pair that collabed on YouTube all the time, so obviously people shipped them.
Obviously.
But people went like really far. Some of the fanfiction didn't even come across as like the wild ideas of fangirls as much as it did like speculative fiction. People were genuinely wondering if they were romantically involved in real life, and keep in mind, neither of them were out at the time.
Oof.
A couple years ago, Dan and Phil each came out as gay, and they eventually confirmed that they had been romantically involved. They even specifically said that the speculation and the fanfiction and the shipping actively hurt their relationship.
Yeah, the internet just can't let people be friends without making it awkward. But that's worse than awkward. That feels like a legitimate intrusion into their private lives. At the same time, I feel like if their fans knew what was going on, maybe they would have been a little bit more respectful.
You really think so?
Yeah, maybe not. Fans, especially young fans, do not always understand the consequences of their actions.
Not to mention, they often forget that creators are people. They feel a profound sense of entitlement to their lives. Maybe people can look back and see this as wrong, but since you can never know what's going on in someone's private life, wouldn't it be better to just assume that someone could be hurt from your actions and act accordingly?
I think the Dan and Phil thing is an extreme case and it really sucks. Like, I feel like there's certainly lines that need to be drawn and respected in general between fans and celebs, especially internet celebs like YouTubers and streamers who are more accessible to their fans. People should stop the speculation, stop the harassment, stop the stalking behavior, all that. But I don't think a blanket ban on RPF is the answer.
I'm not totally confident either, but I think at the very least, people should be much more mindful of the kind of content they put out. Like, not shipping people who know each other in real life, or writing fanfics about people who are clearly uncomfortable with it.
The thing is, how can you be sure what someone is or isn't comfortable with? What about the people who might not even know what fanfiction is, let alone realize that people are writing it about them? It's not reasonable to expect fans to get their consent, but by your logic, fans can't write fanfiction about them because it could be ruining their lives.
See, I wouldn't even want to risk that my fan work is making someone uncomfortable.
Why should fans have to make all the concessions and spaces made by and for them? Someone who doesn't want to read certain subject matter or find fics about themselves can just avoid that content.
That's not necessarily true. Fandom drama or speculation can spill into real life, like what happened with Dan and Phil. The bigger of an internet presence you have and the more interaction you have with your fans, the harder it is to avoid this kind of stuff. Plus, just knowing it's out there might make you uncomfortable.
To me, that's unreasonable. So long as it doesn't cross into harassment or stalking, I don't think you have a right to tell someone to just stop making content about you. Say someone was having fantasies in their own head about a celebrity. Even if that makes the celebrity uncomfortable to imagine, they don't have the right to tell people to stop thinking about them in a certain way.
It's different when it's being disseminated on the internet and people are openly discussing your private life.
I mean, I agree. I think you have the right to ask them to stop, but people don't have to listen to you.
Obviously, they don't have to listen. What's going to make them? RPF and Fandom is barely regulated on most platforms. But I think it's cruel to continue doing something in defiance of the expressed wishes of a person you claim to be a fan of. That's pure entitlement.
But I think fans are entitled. I think they are entitled to make art of anything in the public. Celebs are public figures, so they're essentially open to public interpretation just like published works are.
That's ridiculous. No person's life is owned by the public.
It's not that their lives are owned by the public, but just that certain parts of their lives are in the public sphere. Invading someone's privacy and exposing secret information, that's wrong. But if you willingly release a part of yourself to the public, people don't have to treat it like private information.
I feel like if it's a sensitive topic, like someone's personal relationships, or their family, or sexuality, it's best to just let it be. Sure, you can write whatever you want about someone's Minecraft character, but their real-life friends or partners? That's different. Why not just let those topics be off-limits in general?
That's how you feel, but every creator will define their own boundaries differently. How do we come up with a blanket rule that applies to all public figures? The only rule like that I can think of is just avoid all RPF.
What if the rule were just, don't write fanfiction of people or topics that the person has explicitly asked you not to?
This raises two issues. One, what about the people who have no idea what RPF is? And two, if fans are relying on certain people to give them permission to keep doing what they're doing, doesn't this place pressure on those people to consent to it, even if it does make them uncomfortable?
That's true, but it's also so difficult to avoid. The best I could say is we should normalize setting up boundaries between public figures and their fans. Then fans wouldn't feel betrayed when their faves enforce those boundaries.
The next question is, what if the requests or boundaries of the faves become too unreasonable for fans to follow?
How could that happen? The most extreme restrictive rule a public figure could come up with for fans as it applies to fanworks could be, please do not make any fanworks of me at all. If this is supposed to be a slippery slope, I don't see how it could get any more extreme.
You see, I already think that that's too restrictive, though.
I know that the spirit of fanfiction is to be transgressive and rules or regulations feel unnatural. But what would be the real negative effects? How would banning RPF on the biggest platforms like AO3 affect the rest of fandom culture? The majority of fanworks involve fictional characters, not real people.
It's about the precedent it sets. If fans start bending to other people's will, it'll get increasingly hard to express yourself freely. Platforms could place more restrictive demands regarding what fans can and cannot do, past the point of what many would consider reasonable. And what is or isn't reasonable is subjective anyway, so putting any restrictions in place means someone is going to find it unreasonable.
Again, I just don't really buy into the slippery slope thing. Why would platforms want to put any more restrictions in place?
To please the famous people write fics about, I guess? I mean, if they decide to ban RPF due to the wishes of celebrities, it might make sense for them to ban works of certain characters if the original creators don't want people making fan works of them.
I would say that wouldn't happen, but I guess it already has. I checked the rules on fanfiction.net and saw that not only is RPF totally banned, but there is a list of certain authors whose works you're not allowed to write fanfiction about, like Anne Rice and other people who've said that they don't want fanfiction written about their stuff.
Wow, AO3 definitely does not have those restrictions in place.
To be fair, I don't think these rules are strictly enforced, because I've for sure seen RPF on fanfic.net, but it does show a huge difference in the two sites' approaches to content regulation, as in AO3 has no regulation.
Which makes fanfic.net seem prudish and creatively stifling in comparison. Like, even beyond those rules, they have even weirder ones, like you're not allowed to do any interactive stories or second-person stories of any kind.
That could be why so many people have left fanfiction.net for AO3 now.
Oh, it definitely is. Are you familiar with the cursed fanfiction era known as Critics United?
Oh god, yes. When all those fanfiction.net users formed a collaborative union calling themselves critics and claiming to be saving the site.
Yes, their whole point was that site rules were not being enforced enough, and there wasn't enough moderation. But their solution was to mass report stories and users for the most minor of mistakes, or even just for being bad. The site, once considered unusable due to lack of rules and regulations, became unusable due to a small coalition of users essentially acting as fandom vigilantes or cops, wielding what little power they had to drive all the people they didn't like off the platform. And that's exactly what happened. People mostly consider fanfiction.net dead now.
How did we get on this topic?
I just don't want to see the same thing happen to AO3 too. I don't think any users want to see that happen.
But consider the flip side. Think about what happens, or is happening, when we let fandoms just run rampant with no rules, no boundaries, nothing. Many fandoms, and just fandom culture in general, have bad reputations. They're thought of as toxic, ignorant, immature, and even abusive to creators and other fans. Regulating the platforms where fans engage in bad behavior could improve their image.
I don't think sites like AO3 are where most of this takes place, though.
True, but if such an influential site like that were to put in place some basic regulations, it might have an effect on the whole attitude of fandom.
Or people would just leave AO3 and go to the next new fanfiction site. That's what happened with fanfic.net, or even Tumblr. A lot of people went to Twitter after the purge.
Fair. That may just be the fandom circle of life. But if I were a betting man, I would say that fans don't really care about RPF. They just want their Super Hulock and their Omegaverse and what have you.
Yeah, as long as you don't pull a Tumblr and ban all the NSFW stuff, I think there will still be fans who like to stick to the platform they're familiar with. But here's the thing. Even if we say the best thing to do is to ban all RPF, like maybe make certain exceptions for some people, you still have the issue of enforcement.
I know, but I have more hope in AO3's ability to do that than fanfiction.net's. AO3 is run by the Organization for Transformative Works, a real nonprofit. They have employees and volunteers who actually work to resolve complaints and go through reports of site violations.
That's a good point. There are things that can get you reported, but not a lot when it comes to the actual content of your stories. And I like that. Nobody has the authority to dictate what other people on the site can or cannot make. You can only control what you see and what you put out there.
I know that moderation feels like censorship, and yeah, I guess it kind of is, but I think we can still have free speech and expression with common sense. That's how it works in the real world, after all. We don't just let people do whatever they want regardless of real world consequences.
Why is this particular issue so important for you? Like, of all the places to draw the line, why would RPF be the one thing we ban from fan sites?
I guess I just see it as an invasion of privacy. I have some experience with stuff like this too, on a much smaller scale.
Like, with stuff you've written?
No, like I swear this has been happening to me every time I made new friends since like elementary school. Do you ever get close to someone and then all your friends ask you obsessively if you like them?
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Somehow this happened to me every single time I became friends with a boy. Like, my friends would insist that we must be into each other somehow, and eventually I would just go along with it so they would leave me alone. Then the boy would eventually find out, and it would ruin our relationship. Does that sound familiar?
Oof. Yeah, that's an oof.
I just wish boundaries were clearer between friends, between fans and creators, and between celebrities and their fans, etc.
I mean, if famous figures were clearer with their boundaries and if fans were more respectful of their wishes, then there wouldn't be a need for regulation. People would just do their best not to hurt others and everything would be great.
Yeah, that would in fact be great. I think the bottom line is that we should start treating famous people as people and take their privacy and wishes seriously. We protect the right of users to not be harassed or stalked online, and we should afford famous figures some of that too. That's why I think RPF is a special instance.
To me, there are just things in fanfiction that I think of as way more over the line than RPF.
Like what?
Well, that's another discussion.
Alrighty, so what did you want to talk about?
Alright, so far we have been talking about RPF as it pertains to certain people, namely adults.
Oh no.
Yeah, I feel like we have to go there.
But do we though?
I mean, it's an issue. People are literally writing RPF of underage celebrities and internet personalities. Like, even if it's not literal smut, it still feels so wrong and creepy. Talk about a lack of consent.
You're right. It's non-consensual, but in a totally different way. While I am put off by the idea of RPF written about adults because the adults have not given their consent, minors are completely unable to consent.
Exactly. We can't expect minors to establish boundaries with their audience or anything like that. Instead, it falls on us adults to protect them. That's why I'm so surprised this stuff is just considered fine in fandom.
Now, I wouldn't say that's the case. A lot of people in fandom are vocally against shipping or smut or anything like that with minors, or just RPF with them in general. The people who write and read this stuff are in the minority.
That's true. I suppose that's one of the things debated in the whole pro-shipper v anti-war.
I wish we could all just agree that smut about real-life children is wrong. It's wrong, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a complete violation of dignity, consent, and privacy on like a whole different level than other RPF.
Bannable?
I mean, if anything is worth deplatforming, I'd say it's smut of literal, real-life minors.
Okay, glad we're on the same page there.
I do believe there is more of a debate to be had around fictional minors, like fan works of characters who are canonically underage, shipping them with each other, with adults, drawing risque fan art, etc. I think that's more of a hazy area.
I agree it's more complicated, but I still think people should avoid adult themes in fanfic with underage characters. Like, shipping people of the same age is fine, but don't get sexual with it.
This is more gray area. What is sexual versus innocent? Some people could definitely read into things and see them as sexual, but it might just all be suggested or even unintentional.
I know it's going to be difficult to determine, but I feel like we gotta do it. I just say we remove smutty fanworks of children, fictional or real, from AO3 and Tumblr and DeviantArt, wherever. It's totally unethical, bordering on illegal.
I definitely agree when it comes to real-life children, but just to play devil's advocate, I think there is an argument to be made about keeping fiction, and thereby fanfiction, a space to explore themes and situations that we know would not be acceptable in real life. Art involving fictional characters doesn't directly impact anyone like RPF does.
I believe in creative freedom to a point. I still don't think anybody should be writing or drawing smut of underage characters.
I think the term smut could be skewing the conversation. It sounds too much like porn. But do you remember that one fanfic you found about Zuko?
The one where he'd been sexually abused as a child?
Right, that obviously involved putting Zuko in, bad NSFW situations. But it wasn't erotic at all. It was to make a point about abuse and how it would impact his character.
That's fair. That's an instance where you could argue an underage character was sexualized, but it didn't feel creepy because I got the sense that it was supposed to make you feel sick reading it. That being said, I still didn't really like how graphic that fanfiction was about his abuse. I think the author could have left more of it just implied to avoid writing sexual scenes involving a child.
On that point, I agree with you. I think graphic content for shock value is tired. But my point is banning any potentially mature content with minors is a really broad measure to combat what I think is a specific issue, content that sexualizes real-life minors.
Have you thought about it this way? What if by sexualizing underage fictional characters, we are normalizing the sexualization of underage people in real life?
Okay, this is what I want to talk about. To me, kids, and especially teens, are already so sexualized in our culture.
This is true. TV, movies, advertising, we sexualize young people all the time.
I honestly find it gross, but the vast majority of people don't call it out or even see it as strange. I think that's why I get so upset calls to crack down on fan works involving minors. We don't even hold mainstream media to this standard.
Mainstream media is sexualized, but it's rarely just smut.
Alright, so think of a fanfiction that involves two underage characters hooking up. A lot of people would be upset about that, right?
Some people would be, yeah. It would make me uncomfortable for sure.
Now imagine that exact same scene in a mainstream teen movie being acted out by actors. No one would bat an eye. I can name 10 teen movies or shows that do that exact same thing.
You might be right, but there's one thing to remember. Most of the time, the actors playing these underage characters are adults in their 20s.
That's a whole other thing. I feel like it's how mainstream media gets away with sexualizing teens so much. Not only does it let them avoid using child actors, it also lets them hire hot young adults who their mainly adult audience will naturally find attractive. Truly an advanced level strat.
And as a result of all the adult actors playing kids, it warps our perception of teenagers. We think of them as both looking and acting like adults, which normalizes sexualizing them in real life.
Exactly. And getting back to the topic of fan work, I do think that there is a fandom equivalent of this.
Aging up characters to ship them with adults.
Yup.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that too. I suppose it gets around the issue of sexualizing minors directly, but it feels like an obvious way to get away with shipping minors. It's almost like you're acknowledging what you're doing wouldn't or shouldn't fly.
I feel the same way about TV and movies casting adults as kids. My point is, if you're against any and all sexual scenes involving teens in fanfiction, fine, whatever. But call out the other, much more influential media that does it too.
I get that.
I am against adults sexualizing minors. I think it's gross, and I do think it does genuine harm to teens and kids, like you were saying. But at the same time, I don't think that all stories involving minors and sexual themes are unacceptable. Sexuality can be integral to the coming-of-age experience.
I think what we're touching on here is that there's a difference between stories written to be smut versus those written to be taken more seriously or make some kind of point. Essentially, intent matters, not just content.
I can totally understand why people might push back against that, but I would actually agree that intent matters. Or should I say, framing matters.
I absolutely agree with this when it comes to books and most media. Fanfiction does seem a little different, though, and I wonder if it's because so much fanfic is meant to be sexually exciting in some way, that people just assume that any explicit story is basically smut.
That's a good point. If you say something like, fanfiction about X person, people are probably going to assume it's either about shipping them or it's sexy in some way. So when you hear fanfiction about X child character, it rings alarm bells.
Yeah, I think if the fan work about fictional minors doesn't get any more explicit than the source material does, it's not an issue. Like, fan art of Aang shirtless riding the Unagi is innocent because that's how it happens in Avatar. Fan art of Katara shirtless is not innocent.
Yeah, that might be a good general rule of thumb as a creator. Don't go further than the original does. But I also think that since you can't point towards a specific individual, that you're directly harming, justifying regulation of this kind of fan work is more difficult. If some people want to push the boundaries more, and they use the appropriate tags so that actual kids can't just stumble across it without being warned, then I think the benefits of allowing creative freedom outweigh the negative effects of that content existing.
I get that there is a difference between I think this content is wrong so I won't create it and this content is so wrong we must ban it. But then there's this murky middle ground of I think this content is wrong but I don't think it should be banned, but I do think we should heavily discourage it.
Ah, yes, the pro shipper v anti issue.
Indeed.
Of those, I guess I'm more of a if you think certain content is wrong, don't create it, don't consume it, don't engage with that person. The old don't like, don't read approach. I know that's cliche and maybe overly simplistic, but I think it's a reliable attitude to take to an internet where fandoms will always be filled with people pushing boundaries, crossing lines, and hopefully making good use of content warnings. After all, there is a lot of content online that could trigger people, and a lot of content that is just straight up harmful. But we don't regulate or ban it all. We discuss it, we warn people, and we walk away from the computer if it gets to be too much.
Or we stay online until 3 a.m. staring at our screens in the dark at content that we absolutely know will upset us and getting into fight with Twitter strangers about it.
You have a point. Walking away is definitely easier said than done.
For me, I feel like fandom spaces should have a policy, maybe an unofficial one, of discouraging explicit content of fictional minors in fandoms. I just think that that would do a lot of good when it comes to protecting kids from seeing explicit content of minors online, reducing the normalization of sexualizing them in real life, and making fandom spaces just a little less toxic by putting an end to this incessant debate.
But if it's not outright banned and people do it anyway, this unofficial policy would just embolden others to seek out NSFW works of minors and shame the creators. It wouldn't really reduce toxicity in fandom.
Well, maybe reducing toxicity is an unrealistic goal.
That makes me sad.
Everyone is in the same boat. Everyone just wants to enjoy their fandom content in peace and not be shamed or attacked for it. But as long as the so-called antis and the so-called pro-shippers have diametrically opposed opinions on what appropriate content is, it's going to be impossible.
This is why I wonder what would happen if the platform just stepped in and made some kind of official policy. Even if it's an unpopular one, even if it's one I disagree with, maybe fans would stop self-policing then.
There will always be debates on what is moral or ethical content to create or consume, in fandom and in mainstream media. I have my opinions, you have yours, everyone has their own. I just can't believe it's gotten this toxic.
I know, and each side, quote unquote, is just going to justify their behavior by accusing the other side of worse behavior, like justifying shaming people because they make harmful content, or justifying harassing people because they harass someone else. But I just wish we could all just stop and acknowledge that the damage caused by this toxic debate outweighs the damage caused by all fan works of any kind. Like, to paraphrase Sarah Z, fanfiction is not that important.
I agree with that, at least. We all need to take a deep breath, calm down a little.
And go outside.
Yeah, maybe go outside.
Do you want to take a break and go for a walk or something?
That would honestly be great.